I driver sit him. I don't want to sit near him. Move me immediately, or I'll have your airline shut down by morning.
Victoria Ashworth's voice cut through the first-class cabin like crystal breaking against marble. Her manicured finger adorned with a diamond ring worth more than most people's annual salary pointed directly at Marcus Thompson in seat 3B. She didn't whisper. She didn't attempt discretion. The words were delivered with the cold precision of someone accustomed to having her demands met without question. Marcus looked up from his aviation safety manual, his calm brown eyes meeting her gaze for just a moment before returning to the page. He wore faded jeans, a simple navy polo shirt, and worn Adidas sneakers that had seen better days. His laptop bag sitting in the overhead compartment was battered leather with fraying edges. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth, status, or authority, which was exactly how he preferred it. Before we dive deeper into this moment that would change everything, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of how they look, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Because what happens next will remind you that appearances can be deceiving in the most powerful way possible. Victoria Ashworth commanded attention wherever she went. At 50, she maintained the elegant grace of someone who had spent decades in high society. Her cream-colored designer suit hugged her figure perfectly paired with a pearl necklace that caught the cabin lights just so. Her blonde hair was styled in a sophisticated bob, not a strand out of place, despite the early morning flight. She sat in 2A with the poise of someone who belonged in first class, who expected first class, who had never questioned whether she deserved first class. This wasn't her first flight on Pacific Airways Flight 482. She was a frequent traveler, a woman whose charitable foundations took her across the country for fundraising galas and political events. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from senators, governors, and business leaders seeking her support for various causes. Tonight, she was heading to New York for a $5,000 per plate dinner benefiting aviation safety research. The irony would soon become apparent. Elena Rodriguez stood near the galley, watching the interaction unfold with growing unease. At 28, she was relatively new to the flight attendant role, having graduated from training just 8 months ago. This was her first time serving on a flight with such high-profile passengers, and she could feel the pressure mounting. Her supervisor had specifically mentioned that Mrs. Ashworth was an important customer, someone whose satisfaction could impact crew performance reviews. Elena's dark hair was pulled back in the regulation style, her uniform crisp and professional. She had worked hard to get this job, putting herself through community college while working nights at a restaurant. Her parents had immigrated from Honduras when she was 12, and she was the first in her family to work for a major airline. The job meant everything to her, but moments like this made her question what she was willing to compromise. Michael Bennett, the senior flight attendant, emerged from the forward galley with the confidence of someone who had handled difficult passengers before. At 35, he had been with the Pacific Airways for nearly a decade, working his way up from economy to first class. He understood the politics of premium cabin service. VIP passengers like Victoria Ashworth could make or break careers with a single complaint. They donated to airline charity events, sat on foundation boards, and knew people who made decisions about routes and budgets. Michael's blonde hair was perfectly styled, his movements precise and professional. He approached Victoria's seat with the demeanor of someone ready to solve problems quickly and efficiently. Customer satisfaction was his specialty, and he prided himself on never having a complaint escalated to management. He had no intention of breaking that streak today. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashworth," Michael said with practiced warmth. "I understand you have some concerns about the seating arrangement." Victoria's blue eyes flashed with satisfaction. Finally, someone who recognized her importance. "I do indeed. I've specifically requested accommodation away from certain passengers. I'm not comfortable with the current arrangement, and I expect immediate resolution." She gestured toward Marcus, without looking at him directly, as if eye contact might somehow contaminate her. "I have medical sensitivities and anxiety issues that require a calm, peaceful environment." This situation is causing me significant distress." Marcus continued reading his manual, occasionally making notes in the margins with a worn ballpoint pen. The manual was thick, filled with complex diagrams and technical specifications that seemed far too advanced for casual reading. But Marcus studied it with the focus of someone who understood every nuance, every regulation, every protocol outlined in its pages. Sarah Collins, a lifestyle influencer with 500,000 followers, sat in seat 2C with her phone discreetly positioned to capture the unfolding drama. She had built her platform on authentic moments, real conversations about social justice and equality. Her Instagram stories often featured behind-the-scenes glimpses of travel, but this was different. This was exactly the kind of content her audience craved, the kind of moment that could spark important conversations about bias and privilege. Sarah's auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders as she adjusted her phone angle. She wore designer jeans and a silk blouse, the uniform of successful millennial influencers. Her followers trusted her judgment, valued her perspective on social issues, and shared her content at viral rates when something truly mattered. She could feel in her gut that this moment mattered. David Martinez, seated in 4C, lowered his Wall Street Journal as the conversation grew more intense. A 39-year-old investment banker, he traveled this route twice a month for client meetings. He had witnessed his share of uncomfortable passenger interactions over the years, but something about this felt different. The calm way the man in 3B continued reading despite the obvious hostility impressed him. Most people would have reacted, defended themselves, or moved voluntarily to avoid confrontation. David's dark suit was tailored perfectly, his appearance speaking to professional success and frequent travel. His briefcase contained contracts worth millions of dollars, but his attention was entirely focused on the drama unfolding 3 rows ahead. He had grown up in East Los Angeles, the son of immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to give him opportunities they never had. Discrimination wasn't theoretical to him. It was personal, familiar, and infuriating. Captain James Harrison's voice crackled through the intercom from the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently experiencing a brief delay due to passenger accommodation issues. We appreciate your patience as our crew works to resolve the matter quickly." James was 45, a veteran pilot with Pacific Airways who had flown this route hundreds of times. He prided himself on maintaining schedule adherence and customer satisfaction ratings. Delays meant paperwork explanations to management and potential impacts on crew performance metrics. He trusted his cabin crew to handle passenger issues efficiently, but the extended delay was beginning to concern him. In the cockpit, James reviewed the passenger manifest on his tablet. Victoria Ashworth's name appeared with multiple VIP flags in the airline's customer service system. Frequent flyer, major donor to airline-sponsored charities, board member of several aviation-related foundations. The kind of passenger who could make problems disappear or create problems that lasted for months. Elena approached Marcus's seat with visible reluctance. "Sir, I apologize for the disturbance. Would you be willing to consider a seat change? We have some excellent options in our premium economy section that might provide you with more comfort and space." Marcus looked up from his manual, his expression neutral and professional. "I have a confirmed first-class reservation for this specific seat. Is there a particular reason I should move?" His voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations, though nothing in his appearance suggested any special status or influence. He could have been a teacher, a social worker, or a small business owner. His anonymity was deliberate, carefully cultivated over years of observing how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Victoria's voice rose slightly, ensuring nearby passengers could hear her growing frustration. "I have documented medical conditions that require specific accommodations. I cannot be expected to endure anxiety-inducing situations during a cross-country flight. Surely the airline values passenger safety and comfort above all else." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts with deliberate visibility. Names like Senator Williams, Congressman Rodriguez, and Aviation Foundation President Mitchell flashed across the screen as she searched for the number that would resolve her problem most quickly. The other first-class passengers had stopped pretending to mind their own business. Conversations ceased, magazines were lowered, and attention focused entirely on the unfolding confrontation. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, others seemed intrigued by the drama, but no one appeared willing to intervene directly. Marcus closed his manual slowly and looked directly at Elena. "I understand Mrs. Ashworth has concerns. What specific airline policy requires me to change seats based on another passenger's comfort preferences?" The question was asked quietly, professionally, but it carried an undertone that made Elena pause. Most passengers, when pressured by crew members and confronted by hostile fellow travelers, became defensive or accommodating. They didn't ask about specific policies or challenge crew authority with calm precision. Michael stepped forward, sensing that Elena was struggling to maintain control of the situation. "Sir, we're simply trying to ensure all passengers have the most comfortable flight possible. I'm sure you can understand that accommodation and flexibility benefit everyone." "I absolutely understand the goal," Marcus replied evenly. "What I'm asking for is clarification about which specific policy or regulation requires me to move based on another passenger's stated discomfort with my presence." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she processed the exchange. This wasn't going according to plan. Typically, when she expressed displeasure with seating arrangements, problems solved themselves quickly and quietly. Crew members apologized, profusely offered upgrades or alternatives, and ensured her comfort without creating unnecessary drama. But this passenger was asking questions seeking clarification and demonstrating a familiarity with airline policies that seemed unusual for a casual traveler. She decided to escalate. Victoria touched her phone screen and placed a call that would normally end any discussion immediately. "Rebecca, it's Victoria Ashworth. I need to speak with someone at Pacific Airways about a passenger accommodation issue on Flight 482. The conversation was deliberately loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "Yes, I'm currently experiencing a situation that's affecting my safety and comfort. I have specific medical documentation regarding anxiety triggers, and I need immediate resolution." She paused, listening to the response, then continued with growing confidence. "I understand the complications, but I'm sure you recognize my family's support of Pacific Airways through our foundation work. The Martinez Foundation has donated over $2 million to airline safety research in the past 3 years. I'm not requesting special treatment, just standard customer service." Marcus continued reading his manual, but Elena noticed he was taking notes in the margins. With increasing frequency, the notes appeared to be detailed observations about crew behavior, passenger interactions, and policy discussions. His handwriting was precise, professional, almost clinical in its attention to detail. What Elena couldn't know was that Marcus Thompson held one of the most influential positions in commercial aviation. As Chief Training Officer for the National Aviation Consortium, he was responsible for certifying flight crews across 15 major U.S. airlines. Every flight attendant, every pilot, every ground crew supervisor in the Pacific Airways network had been trained according to protocols he had designed and implemented. The manual he was reading wasn't casual travel material. It was the latest update to crew training standards, hot off the press and not yet distributed to frontline employees. Marcus was reviewing it during his quarterly evaluation flight, one of several trips he took annually to observe crew performance in real-world situations. His presence on flights was known only to airline executives and corporate headquarters. Frontline employees had no idea when the man who controlled their certification standards might be seated among their passengers. Marcus had specifically requested Seat 3B because it provided optimal observation angles for crew interactions. He dressed casually to avoid recognition and ensure authentic behavior from flight staff. His mission was always the same: observe how crews handled difficult situations, conflicts between passengers, and pressure from VIP customers. The data he collected influenced training programs that affected thousands of aviation employees across the country. Today's flight was supposed to be routine observation. He had watched Elena's nervous preparation, noted Michael's VIP-focused approach, and observed the crew dynamics during boarding. Everything had seemed normal until Victoria's demand placed him at the center of exactly the kind of situation he was meant to evaluate. The irony wasn't lost on him. Victoria Ashworth, who claimed to champion aviation safety through her foundation work, was creating precisely the kind of discriminatory situation that Marcus's training programs were designed to prevent. Her charitable donations supported research and initiatives that he personally oversaw. Her foundation's aviation safety advocacy work was implemented through protocols he had written. Victoria ended her phone call with obvious satisfaction. The situation is being addressed at the highest levels. I've been assured that passenger comfort and safety remain Pacific Airways' top priorities. She turned to Michael with renewed confidence. I trust this matter will be resolved promptly. I have a very important event in New York, and I cannot afford delays or additional stress. Michael nodded eagerly. Absolutely, Mrs. Ashworth. We're committed to ensuring your complete satisfaction. He approached Marcus again, this time with more authority in his tone. Sir, I need to be direct. We have a passenger with documented medical needs who requires specific accommodations. The most efficient solution is for you to accept our offer of alternative seating. What documentation? Marcus asked quietly. The question caught Michael off guard. Excuse me, you mentioned documented medical needs. What specific documentation validates a requirement for me to change seats? Marcus's tone remained professional, almost academic. But Elena noticed that other passengers were beginning to pay closer attention to his questions. His calm confidence under pressure was starting to shift the energy in the cabin. Sarah Collins had already begun posting Instagram stories about the developing situation. Her first post showed the first-class cabin with the caption, "Watching something disturbing unfold on my flight." This is why we need to keep speaking up about bias and discrimination. Within minutes, her followers were engaging with comments and sharing the story. This is exactly what we've been talking about. Document everything, make sure this goes viral. The hashtag Flight 482 was already beginning to trend in certain social circles. David Martinez had switched from reading his newspaper to taking discreet notes in his phone. As someone who understood corporate liability and public relations disasters, he recognized that this situation was escalating beyond normal passenger service issues. The casual way the man in 3B was asking about policies and documentation suggested familiarity with regulatory frameworks that most travelers wouldn't possess. Victoria, growing frustrated with the extended discussion, decided to deploy her most effective weapon: public influence and political connections. I want everyone to understand that this isn't about personal preference. I'm advocating for passenger rights and safety standards. She stood up, her elegant figure commanding attention throughout the cabin. My foundation works directly with aviation safety organizations to improve travel experiences for everyone. When I identify problematic situations, I have a responsibility to address them. Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to giving speeches at fundraising galas and political events. I've served on aviation safety boards, donated millions to research initiatives, and worked with legislators to improve passenger protection regulations. I know what constitutes appropriate accommodation. Marcus looked up from his manual again, this time with something that might have been curiosity. Which specific aviation safety boards? The question was asked casually, almost conversationally, but it landed with unexpected weight. Victoria hesitated for just a moment before responding. The National Aviation Foundation, the Passenger Safety Initiative, and the Commercial Flight Standards Board, she said, listing impressive-sounding organizations that demonstrated her influence in the industry. Interesting, Marcus replied, making another note in his manual. What specific safety initiatives has your foundation supported recently? Elena watched this exchange with growing confusion. Most passengers, when confronted by someone citing powerful connections and industry influence, would have backed down or sought to diffuse the tension. But Marcus seemed genuinely interested in the details of Victoria's claims, as if evaluating them against some internal knowledge base. Michael stepped between them, sensing that the conversation was moving in a direction he couldn't control. Let's focus on resolving the immediate seating situation rather than discussing industry affiliations. Actually, Marcus said, closing his manual and giving Michael his full attention, I'd like to understand which specific passenger safety regulation supports Mrs. Ashworth's request. Michael felt a flutter of uncertainty. He had handled thousands of passenger complaints over the years, but this was different. Most travelers, even those who complained about discrimination, didn't ask for specific regulatory citations. They expressed frustration, demanded apologies, or accepted alternative solutions. They didn't quiz crew members about policy frameworks with the precision of someone who might actually know the answers. Sir, we have broad discretion to ensure passenger comfort and safety. Michael replied, falling back on standard corporate language. Broad discretion within specific regulatory boundaries, Marcus corrected gently. Could you clarify which regulation grants crew authority to relocate passengers based on other passengers' comfort preferences? The question hung in the air like a challenge that Michael couldn't immediately answer. He knew airline policies about discrimination, understood basic passenger rights, and could recite standard customer service protocols. But Marcus was asking for the kind of detailed regulatory knowledge that required specialized training. Victoria sensed the momentum shifting away from her and decided to escalate further. She pulled out her phone and began dialing another number, this time speaking loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Senator Williams. It's Victoria. I'm calling from a Pacific Airways flight where I'm experiencing discriminatory treatment myself. Yes, I'm being forced to endure an unsafe situation despite my medical documentation and repeated requests for reasonable accommodation. She paused dramatically, ensuring maximum impact from the conversation. I understand the complexity, but this is exactly the kind of situation our aviation safety legislation was designed to address. I need immediate intervention at the highest level. Other passengers began recording video of Victoria's phone call, recognizing that they were witnessing either a legitimate complaint or an abuse of power. Sarah's Instagram livestream was attracting viewers in real time as word spread about the developing confrontation. Marcus opened his manual again and turned to a section marked Discrimination and Bias Protocols. Elena couldn't help but notice that he seemed to know exactly which page to reference, as if the content was deeply familiar to him. His notes in the margins were extensive, detailed, and written in the kind of technical shorthand that suggested professional expertise. Mrs. Ashworth, Marcus said after finishing his phone call, I'm curious about your foundation's specific work on passenger discrimination policies. Victoria straightened her jacket and smoothed her skirt, buying time to formulate a response. Our foundation supports comprehensive research into passenger safety and comfort standards, including protocols for handling bias-based complaints, Marcus asked. Of course, Victoria replied, though her confidence wavered slightly. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. And what conclusions has your foundation reached about balancing individual comfort preferences with anti-discrimination protections? Elena realized she was watching something unprecedented. A passenger was engaging in detailed policy discussion with someone claiming industry expertise while remaining completely calm under pressure that would have overwhelmed most travelers. Either Marcus was remarkably well informed about aviation regulations, or he possessed knowledge that went beyond typical passenger awareness. The cabin had grown unusually quiet as other travelers focused on the increasingly complex exchange. David was now openly typing notes in his phone, recognizing that this confrontation was evolving beyond standard passenger service issues into something that could have broader implications. Captain Harrison's voice returned to the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing to work on our departure delay. We appreciate your patience as our crew ensures all passenger concerns are properly addressed. In the cockpit, James was beginning to worry. Extended delays meant paperwork explanations to operations control and potential impacts on connecting flights. But more concerning was the radio chatter from ground control about elevated passenger situation requiring management review. VIP complaints were serious business, but they usually resolved quickly through standard accommodation procedures. Victoria ended her second phone call with visible satisfaction. The matter is now receiving attention from the highest levels of government and industry oversight. I've been assured that appropriate action will be taken. She looked directly at Marcus for the first time since making her initial demand. I hope you understand that this situation extends far beyond personal preferences. This is about ensuring that aviation safety standards are maintained for all passengers. Marcus smiled slightly, the first change in his expression since the confrontation began. I completely agree, Mrs. Ashworth. Aviation safety should absolutely be maintained for all passengers. Michael Bennett decided it was time to assert his authority definitively. 10 years of flight experience had taught him that prolonged passenger disputes created problems that extended far beyond individual flights. Victoria Ashworth represented the kind of customer whose satisfaction directly influenced crew performance reviews, route assignments, and career advancement opportunities. Whatever this other passenger's concerns might be, they couldn't outweigh the practical realities of airline hierarchy. Sir, I need you to understand that we've exhausted our discussion options. Michael announced, his voice carrying throughout the first-class cabin. Mrs. Ashworth has specific medical documentation and legitimate accommodation needs. Continuing to resist reasonable solutions is creating problems for everyone aboard this aircraft. Elena watched Michael's approach with growing unease. Her training had emphasized de-escalation customer service and finding mutually acceptable solutions to passenger conflicts. But this felt different. She couldn't shake the impression that Marcus wasn't a typical passenger, that his questions about policies and regulations suggested knowledge that went beyond casual travel experience. What specific medical documentation? Marcus asked, maintaining his calm tone while making another detailed note in his manual. That's confidential patient information, Michael replied quickly. Of course, Marcus agreed. But you've referenced medical documentation as justification for requiring me to move. I'm asking what type of medical condition grants one passenger the right to determine where other passengers may sit. Victoria stood up again, her elegant frame commanding attention throughout the cabin. Her cream-colored suit remained perfectly pressed despite the morning's stress, and her pearl necklace caught the light as she turned to address not just Marcus, but the entire group of nearby passengers. I want everyone here to witness what's happening, she declared with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention at political fundraisers and charity galas. I have panic disorder and documented anxiety triggers that require specific environmental controls. My physician has provided detailed medical documentation about situations that can cause severe psychological distress. She gestured toward Marcus without making direct eye contact. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm requesting basic accommodation that protects my health and safety during this flight. Sarah Collins was live-streaming the entire exchange to her Instagram audience, which had grown to over 15,000 viewers as word spread about the developing confrontation. Comments were flooding in from followers expressing support, outrage, and demands for more details about the situation. This is exactly what we've been talking about, Sarah whispered to her phone. Bias, disguised as medical necessity, we're documenting everything, so there's no question about what really happened here. David Martinez had moved from taking notes to active documentation, using his phone to record audio of the conversation while maintaining his position in seat 4C. As an investment banker familiar with corporate liability issues, he recognized that this situation was creating exactly the kind of evidence that could trigger significant legal and public relations consequences. Marcus looked up from his manual and addressed Victoria directly for the first time since her initial demand. Mrs. Ashworth, could you explain which specific aspect of my presence triggers your medical condition? The question was asked professionally, without hostility or sarcasm, but it cut straight to the heart of Victoria's complaint. Elena watched Victoria's face carefully, noting the slight hesitation before her response. I have generalized anxiety disorder with specific triggers related to unfamiliar social situations and unpredictable passenger behavior. Victoria answered, her tone maintaining the clinical precision that gave her complaints an air of medical legitimacy. What unpredictable behavior have you observed from me? Marcus asked. Victoria faltered slightly. It's not about observed behavior, it's about potential risks and my need for a controlled environment during air travel. So your request is based on potential future behavior, rather than any actual interactions we've had. Elena realized she was witnessing something significant. Marcus wasn't arguing, complaining, or demanding anything. He was simply asking questions that revealed the logical holes in Victoria's position. His approach was methodical, almost academic, like someone conducting an investigation, rather than defending himself. Michael stepped between them again, sensing that Victoria's medical justifications were beginning to sound less convincing under Marcus's careful questioning. The specific details don't matter. What matters is that we have a solution that accommodates everyone's needs. Actually, Marcus replied, the specific details matter quite a bit when determining whether a request constitutes reasonable accommodation or discriminatory treatment. Michael felt a chill of recognition. Marcus was using language that sounded suspiciously familiar terminology from the employee training sessions that covered discrimination policies and passenger rights. Most travelers didn't distinguish between reasonable accommodation and discriminatory treatment with such precision. Captain James Harrison's voice returned to the intercom with growing concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently working with ground control and passenger services to resolve our departure delay. We anticipate additional time will be required before we can proceed with takeoff." Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor's status update needed on first-class passenger situation. Corporate Operations is requesting immediate report. She realized that whatever was happening in the cabin had attracted attention from airline management. Standard passenger complaints didn't trigger corporate oversight unless they involved potential legal liability or public relations risks. Victoria pulled out her phone again and began scrolling through her contacts with deliberate visibility. "I think it's time to involve Pacific Airways executive leadership directly. I have personal relationships with several board members who understand the importance of passenger safety and accommodation." She placed another call, speaking loudly enough to ensure maximum impact. "Jonathan, it's Victoria Ashworth. I'm experiencing a serious passenger safety situation on Flight 482 that requires immediate executive intervention." The conversation was clearly intended for public consumption. "Yes, I understand the complexity, but this passenger is refusing reasonable accommodation requests based on documented medical needs. The crew seems unable or unwilling to enforce basic safety protocols." Marcus continued reading his manual during Victoria's phone performance, but Elena noticed that his note-taking had become even more detailed. Whatever he was documenting appeared to be comprehensive, professional, and potentially significant. Sarah's live stream audience had grown to over 25,000 viewers, as clips from her broadcast were shared across multiple social media platforms. The hashtag Flight 482 was trending nationwide, with users posting comments, theories, and demands for updates about the unfolding confrontation. "We've now got corporate executives involved," Sarah narrated to her audience. "This wealthy woman is literally calling her powerful friends to have this black passenger removed from his seat. This is privilege in action, people." David had shifted to recording video from his phone, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond typical passenger service issues into something that could have broader implications for airline policies and corporate accountability. Other first-class passengers were now openly watching and recording the exchange. A technology executive in Seat 1B was taking photos and posting updates to LinkedIn. A federal judge in Seat 4A was making notes about potential civil rights violations. The casual Friday morning flight had become a documented public confrontation with dozens of witnesses. Victoria ended her phone call with obvious satisfaction. Executive leadership is now aware of the situation and has assured me that appropriate action will be taken immediately. They understand the liability issues involved when passenger safety requests are ignored. She turned to address the cabin directly, speaking with the practiced confidence of someone who had given speeches to senators and governors. "I want everyone to understand that this isn't personal. I'm advocating for passenger rights and safety standards that protect all travelers." Marcus looked up from his manual and smiled slightly. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm curious about your foundation's position on aviation discrimination policies. Our foundation supports comprehensive passenger protection initiatives," Victoria replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure where his question was leading. including protections against discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or perceived social status, Marcus asked. Victoria hesitated. Of course, our foundation supports equal treatment for all passengers. Excellent, Marcus said, making another note. Then you'll be pleased to know that your current actions are being evaluated against exactly those standards. Elena felt something shift in the cabin atmosphere. Marcus had said the words casually, almost conversationally, but they carried an undertone of authority that made everyone pause. He wasn't making threats or demands. He was simply stating that evaluation was taking place as if he possessed the knowledge and position to conduct such evaluation. Michael stepped forward with growing frustration. Sir, whatever your concerns about airline policies, the immediate issue is resolving the seating conflict. We need to move forward with practical solutions. I agree completely, Marcus replied. The practical solution is to follow established anti-discrimination protocols rather than accommodating requests based on bias. This is medical accommodation, not discrimination, Michael insisted. Marcus turned to a specific page in his manual and read aloud, medical accommodation requests must be based on documented conditions that cannot be reasonably addressed through alternative means. Requests that effectively exclude other passengers based on identity characteristics constitute discrimination regardless of claimed medical justification. Elena's eyes widened. Marcus had just quoted what sounded like official airline policy with word-perfect precision. Either he had memorized passenger rights regulations with extraordinary thoroughness, or he possessed access to policy documents that weren't available to typical travelers. Victoria's confidence wavered for the first time since the confrontation began. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. Marcus closed his manual and looked at her directly. "I'm a passenger with a confirmed first-class reservation who's documenting how airline crews handle discrimination complaints disguised as medical accommodation requests." The statement hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything but explained nothing. Elena realized that Marcus had just acknowledged he was deliberately documenting crew behavior, which suggested his presence on the flight wasn't casual or coincidental. David Martinez put down his phone and leaned forward, recognizing that the situation had just shifted into territory that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Whatever Marcus represented, he clearly possessed knowledge and authority that went far beyond typical passenger awareness. The cabin fell silent as Victoria processed the implications of Marcus's statement. Her elaborate performance political phone calls and medical claims had just been reframed as discriminatory behavior being actively documented by someone who understood aviation regulations with suspicious precision. For the first time since boarding the flight, Victoria Ashworth looked uncertain about her position. Victoria Ashworth's uncertainty lasted exactly 15 seconds before her survival instincts kicked in. Decades of navigating high society politics and corporate boardrooms had taught her that, when challenged, the most effective response was to escalate with overwhelming force. If this passenger thought he could intimidate her with policy citations and mysterious documentation, he was about to discover just how extensive her network really was. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number that made Michael's face go pale when he recognized the name on her screen. Rebecca Morrison, Senior Vice President of Customer Relations for Pacific Airways. "Rebecca, it's Victoria. I need immediate intervention on Flight 482. I'm being harassed by a passenger who's attempting to interfere with legitimate medical accommodation requests." Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to having problems solved through executive pressure. The conversation was deliberately loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "Yes, I understand protocol, but this passenger appears to be deliberately documenting our exchange for some kind of litigation or media campaign. I'm concerned about privacy violations and potential safety issues." Elena watched Victoria's performance with growing unease. She had never seen a passenger deploy this level of political weaponry over a seating dispute, and she was beginning to suspect that the situation was spiraling beyond anything her training had prepared her to handle. "I need security involvement and immediate resolution," Victoria continued into her phone. My anxiety levels are reaching dangerous territory, and I cannot be responsible for medical emergencies caused by airline negligence. Marcus continued reading his manual, but Elena noticed that his note-taking had become even more methodical. He was documenting not just what people said, but timestamps, exact quotes, and detailed observations about crew responses. His documentation looked professional official, like evidence being compiled for formal review. Michael approached Marcus again, this time with backup. He had summoned Jennifer Walsh, the lead flight attendant for economy class, to assist with what he now described as a passenger compliance issue. Jennifer was 42, a 20-year veteran of Pacific Airways who had handled everything from medical emergencies to terrorist threats. She approached the situation with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had seen every possible passenger problem multiple times. "Sir, I need you to understand that we're now dealing with a medical emergency situation," Jennifer announced firmly. Mrs. Ashworth has documented anxiety disorder that's being triggered by this prolonged confrontation. For her health and safety, we require your cooperation with alternative seating." Marcus looked up from his manual. "What specific medical emergency protocols are you implementing?" The question caught Jennifer off guard. "Excuse me. You've declared a medical emergency. What specific protocols does that trigger? Are you calling for ground medical support? Are you documenting vital signs? Are you implementing anxiety disorder treatment procedures?" Jennifer realized she had walked into a trap. She had used medical emergency as leverage to compel compliance, but Marcus was asking about the actual protocols that terminology would require. If there was really a medical emergency, she should be following specific procedures that she hadn't initiated. "We're monitoring the situation," she replied weakly. How specifically, Marcus asked, making another note. Elena watched this exchange with growing fascination and concern. Marcus wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was exposing gaps in crew knowledge and inconsistencies in their approach. His questions revealed familiarity with airline procedures that went far beyond passenger awareness. Sarah Collins was providing live commentary to her Instagram audience, which had grown to over 40,000 viewers as news of the confrontation spread across social media platforms. Major influencer accounts were resharing her content, and news outlets were beginning to monitor the situation. "This is what privilege looks like," Sarah narrated to her phone. "A wealthy white woman using medical claims and political connections to have a black passenger removed from his seat. And now they're claiming medical emergency when he asks basic questions about their procedures." David Martinez was documenting everything on his phone while simultaneously researching Pacific Airways' corporate structure and executive leadership. As an investment banker, he understood that public relations disasters could trigger stock price fluctuations and corporate shakeups. This situation was developing all the characteristics of a crisis that could have lasting business implications. Victoria ended her phone call with renewed confidence. Executive leadership is sending security and management representatives to address this situation immediately. They understand the liability issues involved when passengers refuse to comply with medical accommodation requests. She turned to address Marcus directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way through institutional pressure. "I don't know what your agenda is, but you're about to discover that there are consequences for disrupting airline operations and endangering passenger safety." Marcus looked at her with something that might have been curiosity, Mrs. Ashworth. "When you speak with your Foundation colleagues about aviation safety, do you typically discuss discrimination protocols?" "Our Foundation focuses on research and policy development," Victoria replied cautiously. "Including passenger rights research," Marcus asked. "Among other initiatives, what specific research has your foundation published about balancing medical accommodation with anti-discrimination protections?" Victoria hesitated. She could cite fundraising totals, political connections, and board memberships, but Marcus was asking about specific policy research that she wasn't sure her foundation had actually conducted. Her expertise was in networking influence and leveraging relationships rather than technical policy development. "We support comprehensive research conducted by industry experts," she replied evasively. "Could you name some of those experts?" Marcus asked, making another detailed note in his manual. Elena realized she was watching something unprecedented. Marcus was conducting what felt like a professional interview or policy evaluation, probing Victoria's claims about industry knowledge and foundation work. Either he was remarkably well prepared for this confrontation, or he possessed expertise that went far beyond typical passenger awareness. Captain James Harrison appeared at the cockpit door, his face showing the stress of managing a delay that had attracted corporate attention and security involvement. At 45, James had navigated complex passenger situations before, but extended delays with VIP complaints typically resolved through accommodation and compensation rather than prolonged confrontation. "What's the status down here?" James asked Michael quietly. "Passenger compliance issue with medical accommodation complications." Michael replied using the corporate language that made problems sound technical rather than discriminatory. James approached Marcus with the authority of someone who controlled the aircraft and everyone aboard it. "Sir, I'm Captain Harrison. I understand we're having difficulty resolving a passenger service issue that's affecting our departure schedule." Marcus stood up to address the captain directly, showing the first movement he had made since the confrontation began. Elena noticed that when he stood, his posture and bearing suggested confidence and authority that his casual clothes had effectively hidden. "Captain Harrison, I have a confirmed first-class reservation for this seat. Could you explain which specific regulation grants crew authority to relocate passengers based on other passengers' comfort preferences?" James felt a chill of recognition. Marcus was using terminology and asking questions that sounded familiar from his own training sessions about discrimination policies and passenger rights. Captains received regular updates about legal compliance liability issues and proper procedures for handling bias-related complaints. "We have broad discretion to ensure passenger safety and comfort," James replied, falling back on standard corporate language. "Within specific regulatory boundaries," Marcus corrected gently. "Could you clarify which FAA regulation grants that discretion in cases involving potential discrimination?" James realized he was being asked about specific regulations that he should know but couldn't cite from memory. Pilots received training about passenger rights and discrimination policies, but Marcus was asking for the kind of detailed regulatory knowledge that required specialized expertise. Victoria sensed an opportunity to regain control of the narrative. "Captain, I want you to understand that this passenger has been aggressively questioning airline staff and creating a hostile environment despite my documented medical needs. I'm concerned about his intentions and potential threat to passenger safety." She pulled out her phone again and showed James her contact list, which included names he recognized as senior airline executives and aviation industry leaders. "I've already spoken with Rebecca Morrison and Senator Williams about this situation. Everyone understands the liability issues involved." Marcus turned to Captain Harrison with renewed interest. "Captain, when you complete incident reports about discrimination complaints, do you typically document passengers' political connections as relevant factors?" The question landed like a bomb. James realized that Marcus was suggesting formal incident reporting, which meant official documentation, corporate review, and potential regulatory investigation. Standard passenger complaints didn't trigger incident reports unless they involved serious policy violations or legal liability. "This is a customer service issue, not a discrimination complaint," James replied carefully. Based on what criteria, Marcus asked, opening his manual to a section titled Incident Classification Protocols. Elena watched James's face as he processed Marcus's question. The captain clearly recognized that Marcus was referencing official procedures with uncomfortable precision. Either Marcus was extraordinarily well informed about aviation regulations, or he possessed knowledge that went beyond passenger awareness. Jennifer Walsh decided to try a different approach. "Sir, regardless of the policy discussions, we have practical concerns about departure delays and passenger safety. Extended confrontations create problems for everyone aboard the aircraft." "I agree completely," Marcus replied. "Extended confrontations based on discriminatory requests do create problems for everyone. That's exactly why airlines have policies prohibiting such requests." He turned to a specific page in his manual and read aloud, Requests for passenger relocation based on identity characteristics constitute discrimination regardless of claimed justification. Crew members are required to deny such requests and document incidents for corporate review and regulatory reporting. The cabin fell silent as Marcus read what sounded like official airline policy with word-perfect precision. Elena realized that Marcus had just quoted procedures that she had never heard before, but that sounded exactly like the kind of detailed protocols that would exist in corporate training materials. Victoria's phone rang and she answered it with obvious relief. Rebecca, thank goodness. Yes, I'm still dealing with this situation. The passenger is now claiming to quote airline policies and creating more disruption. The conversation was speakerphone loud, ensuring everyone could hear the corporate response. Mrs. Ashworth, I understand your concerns. We're sending a customer service supervisor to address the situation immediately. Security is also being dispatched to handle any compliance issues. Michael felt a surge of satisfaction. Executive support meant this situation would be resolved quickly and decisively. VIP passengers with political connections typically received whatever accommodation they requested, and security involvement would ensure compliance from difficult passengers. But Marcus was making more notes documenting the corporate response with the same precise attention he had applied to crew behavior and passenger interactions. Elena began to suspect that Marcus wasn't just documenting for personal protection. His approach looked professional official, like evidence being compiled for formal review by someone with authority to conduct such review, Captain Harrison Marcus said, closing his manual and giving James his full attention. I need you to understand that this situation is being evaluated against established anti-discrimination protocols. Every decision you make is being documented for regulatory review. James felt something shift in his chest. Marcus wasn't making threats or demands. He was simply stating that evaluation was taking place as if he possessed the authority to conduct such evaluation. The implications were beginning to penetrate James's awareness, though he couldn't yet grasp their full scope. Victoria ended her phone call with renewed confidence. Corporate leadership is handling the situation at the highest levels. Security will ensure compliance with passenger safety requirements. She looked at Marcus with the satisfaction of someone who had deployed overwhelming force successfully. I hope you understand that your behavior has consequences. This incident will be documented and reviewed by people who understand the importance of passenger cooperation. Marcus smiled slightly. Mrs. Ashworth, I couldn't agree more. This incident will definitely be documented and reviewed by people who understand the importance of passenger cooperation. Elena realized that Marcus had just used Victoria's exact words to convey something entirely different. The way he said people who understand carried an undertone that suggested he knew exactly who those people were and what their review would conclude. For the second time since the confrontation began, Victoria looked uncertain about her position. Sarah Collins was no longer just documenting the situation for her Instagram audience. She was becoming the voice of a movement that was exploding across social media platforms in real time. Her follower count had surged past 70,000 as major influencer accounts reshared her content, and news outlets began monitoring her live stream for breaking news updates. This is what we're fighting against. Sarah narrated to her phone, her voice carrying the passion that had made her platform successful. A wealthy woman with political connections literally calling executives and security to have a black passenger removed from his seat because his presence makes her uncomfortable. Comments were flooding her stream faster than she could read them. This is insane. Document everything. Get his name so we can support him. She needs to be exposed. This can't be legal. The hashtag Flight 482 was trending nationally with thousands of users posting reactions, theories, and demands for accountability. But what made Sarah's coverage particularly powerful was her focus on the details that revealed character. She captured Victoria's designer outfit, expensive jewelry, and practiced political phone calls. She documented Marcus's calm responses, thoughtful questions, and professional note-taking. She showed the contrast between wealth exercising privilege and dignity maintaining itself under pressure. "Notice how he's not arguing or getting emotional," Sarah pointed out to her audience. "He's asking questions about policies and taking notes like someone who knows exactly what he's doing." Meanwhile, she's calling senators and threatening lawsuits. David Martinez had moved from passive observation to active documentation. As an investment banker familiar with corporate crisis management, he recognized that this situation was developing all the characteristics of a public relations disaster that could trigger lasting business consequences for Pacific Airways. He was researching the key players while recording the confrontation. Victoria Ashworth's foundation work was legitimate, but focused on fundraising and political networking rather than technical policy development. Her board memberships were prestigious but largely ceremonial. Her political connections were extensive, but primarily transactional based on charitable donations rather than policy expertise. What intrigued David was Marcus's approach to questioning Victoria's claims. Either Marcus was extraordinarily well prepared for this confrontation, or he possessed knowledge about aviation policies that went far beyond typical passenger awareness. His questions weren't random or emotional. They were strategic, methodical, designed to expose gaps and inconsistencies. David began texting updates to his professional network witnessing potential discrimination incident on Flight 482. Wealthy passenger demanding black passenger removal. Could trigger significant liability issues for Pacific Airways. Documenting for potential business implications. The responses came immediately. His colleagues in investment banking understood that public relations disasters could trigger stock price fluctuations, regulatory investigations, and corporate shakeups. Several asked for real-time updates as the situation developed. Elena Rodriguez was experiencing the most stressful 30 minutes of her 8-month career as a flight attendant. Her training had covered passenger conflicts, VIP accommodation, and basic discrimination policies, but nothing had prepared her for a situation where a passenger demonstrated expert knowledge of aviation regulations while being pressured by crew members and threatened by political influence. Elena's family had sacrificed significantly to support her career goals. Her parents worked multiple jobs to help pay for her education, and her success as a flight attendant represented achievement for the entire family. The job meant everything to her, but moments like this made her question what she was willing to compromise. She watched Marcus's calm responses and thoughtful questions with growing respect and concern. He wasn't causing problems or creating confrontation. He was simply asking for clarification about policies and procedures, which should have been his right as a passenger. But the crew's inability to answer his questions was becoming obvious to everyone aboard the aircraft. Elena's phone buzzed with another text from her supervisor, corporate operations, requesting detailed incident report. Document all interactions and passenger statements. Potential legal review required. The message made her stomach drop. Legal review meant this situation was being evaluated for discrimination policy violations and potential liability issues. If the airline determined that crew members had failed to follow proper procedures, there could be serious consequences for everyone involved. But what scared Elena most was her growing suspicion that Marcus wasn't just a passenger who happened to know about aviation regulations. His questions were too precise, his documentation too professional, his approach too methodical. Either he was remarkably well prepared for this confrontation, or he possessed expertise that went far beyond passenger awareness. Jennifer Walsh was beginning to regret her decision to support Michael's aggressive approach. 20 years of flight experience had taught her to recognize when situations were escalating beyond normal passenger service issues into territory that could trigger formal investigations and corporate liability. Marcus's questions about medical emergency protocols had exposed the fact that she had used official terminology without implementing actual procedures. His documentation of crew responses was comprehensive and professional. His knowledge of policies and regulations was suspiciously precise. Jennifer pulled Michael aside and whispered urgently, "We need to step back and follow standard discrimination protocols." This passenger knows too much about airline policies to be handling this casually. Michael bristled at the suggestion that he should back down from VIP passenger demands. Mrs. Ashworth has legitimate accommodation needs and political connections that could impact our careers. We can't let one difficult passenger create problems with executive leadership. But Jennifer had noticed something that Michael hadn't. Marcus wasn't being difficult. He was being methodical, asking questions that revealed gaps in their knowledge and inconsistencies in their approach. His behavior suggested familiarity with aviation regulations that went beyond passenger awareness. Captain James Harrison returned to the cockpit to check on operational status, but his mind was reeling from his interaction with Marcus. The passengers' questions about FAA regulations and incident reporting procedures had been uncomfortably specific. Either Marcus was an aviation lawyer, a regulatory expert, or someone with insider knowledge of airline policies. James pulled up Pacific Airways' customer database on his cockpit computer and searched for Marcus Thompson's passenger profile. The results were puzzling. Marcus had frequent flyer status, but no special designations, VIP flags, or corporate affiliations listed. His travel patterns showed regular flights across multiple routes, but nothing that explained his apparent expertise. What James couldn't access from his cockpit computer were the executive-level databases that contained information about corporate consultants, regulatory officials, and industry experts whose identities were protected for operational security. Marcus's true role was known only to senior management and wasn't visible in standard passenger systems. The intercom crackled with ground control communications. Flight 482. We're receiving reports of passenger service issues requiring management intervention. Security and customer service supervisors are en route to your aircraft. James realized that whatever was happening in the cabin had attracted attention from airport operations, airline management, and potentially regulatory authorities. Standard passenger complaints didn't trigger this level of corporate response unless they involved serious policy violations or legal liability. Victoria was placing yet another phone call, this time to a contact she described as Senator Williams' chief of staff. Her conversation was deliberately loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, designed to demonstrate the extent of her political influence and the serious consequences that would result from failing to accommodate her requests. This is Victoria Ashworth. I need immediate intervention regarding a discrimination situation I'm experiencing on Pacific Airways Flight 482. Yes, discrimination against me based on my medical accommodation needs. She paused dramatically before continuing. I'm being forced to endure an unsafe and hostile environment despite documented anxiety disorder that requires specific seating arrangements. The airline crew seems either unable or unwilling to implement basic passenger protection protocols. Marcus continued taking notes during Victoria's performance, documenting not just what she said but the intended impact of her political name-dropping and the implied threats contained in her seemingly medical complaints. Other first-class passengers were now openly recording the exchange and posting updates to their own social media accounts. A technology executive was live-streaming to LinkedIn describing the situation as a masterclass in privilege and discrimination playing out in real time. A federal judge was taking detailed notes about potential civil rights violations and constitutional issues. The casual Friday morning flight had become a documented public confrontation with dozens of witnesses and multiple live streams reaching audiences across the country. News outlets were beginning to monitor the social media coverage, and several were already preparing stories about airline discrimination and passenger rights. Sarah's Instagram audience had grown to over 90,000 viewers as news of the confrontation continued to spread. She was providing real-time commentary that combined social justice advocacy with compelling storytelling, making the incident accessible and emotionally resonant for a broad audience. What we're seeing here is how the system works, Sarah explained to her followers. Money talks, connections matter, and regular people get pushed around by people who think their wealth gives them the right to discriminate. But Sarah was also documenting something else that intrigued her. Marcus's responses weren't typical of passengers being discriminated against. Most people would have become defensive angry or accommodating under this kind of pressure. Marcus remained calm, methodical, asking questions that revealed his deep understanding of airline policies and procedures. "There's something different about this passenger," Sarah noted to her audience. "He's not just defending himself. He's documenting everything like someone who knows exactly how this process works." The observation was perceptive and would prove to be prophetic. Marcus's documentation and expert questioning weren't coincidental. They were the professional habits of someone whose job involved evaluating exactly these kinds of situations. Victoria ended her latest phone call with obvious satisfaction and turned to address the entire first-class cabin. "I want everyone to understand what's happening here. I'm advocating for passenger safety and medical accommodation rights that protect all travelers. This isn't about personal preferences. This is about ensuring that aviation safety standards are maintained." She gestured toward Marcus with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention at political events and charitable galas. When passengers refuse to cooperate with legitimate accommodation requests, they create safety risks that affect everyone aboard the aircraft. Marcus looked up from his notes and smiled. "Mrs. Ashworth, could you explain which specific aviation safety standard is compromised by my presence in this seat?" The question was asked politely, almost academically, but it cut straight to the core of Victoria's argument. Elena watched Victoria's face carefully as she processed the request for specific rather than general justification. "I have documented medical conditions that create specific environmental requirements," Victoria replied, falling back on clinical language that made her demands sound legitimate. "Which specific environmental factors associated with my presence trigger your medical condition?" Marcus asked. Victoria realized that Marcus was dismantling her medical justification by asking for specifics that she couldn't provide without revealing the discriminatory nature of her actual concerns. Her carefully constructed medical accommodation request was being exposed as bias disguised with clinical terminology. For the third time since the confrontation began, Victoria Ashworth looked uncertain about her position. The arrival of airport security changed the entire dynamic aboard Flight 482. Officer Patricia Chen and her partner, Officer Rodriguez, boarded the aircraft with the grim efficiency of professionals who had handled countless passenger disturbances, but their presence immediately escalated the tension throughout the first-class cabin. Patricia was a 15-year veteran of airport security who had dealt with everything from intoxicated passengers to terrorist threats. She approached passenger conflicts with the methodical professionalism that came from understanding how quickly situations could escalate beyond control. But as she surveyed the scene, she realized this wasn't a typical disturbance. "I'm Officer Chen with airport security," she announced to the cabin. "We're responding to reports of a passenger compliance issue that's affecting flight operations." Victoria immediately stood up, her elegant figure commanding attention as she prepared to deploy her full arsenal of political influence and social authority. This was the moment she had been building toward, the arrival of official enforcement that would validate her complaints and resolve the situation in her favor. "Officer, thank you for responding so quickly." Victoria began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously by people in uniform. "I've been trying to address a serious passenger safety situation that the flight crew seems unable to handle effectively." She gestured toward Marcus without making direct eye contact, maintaining the clinical distance that gave her complaints an air of medical legitimacy rather than personal bias. "I have documented anxiety disorder that requires specific environmental accommodations during air travel. This passenger is creating a hostile and unsafe environment despite my repeated requests for reasonable assistance." Officer Chen had heard similar complaints dozens of times, and she understood the delicate balance between accommodating passenger concerns and avoiding discrimination. Her training emphasized de-escalation documentation and finding solutions that protected everyone's rights without creating additional conflicts. Sir Officer Chen addressed Marcus professionally. "Could you please explain your perspective on the situation?" Marcus looked up from his manual with the calm confidence that had characterized his responses throughout the confrontation. I have a confirmed first-class reservation for this seat. Mrs. Ashworth has requested that I be relocated based on her stated discomfort with my presence. I've asked crew members to clarify which specific airline policy supports her request, but I haven't received satisfactory answers. Officer Chen noted Marcus's precise language and professional demeanor. Most passengers involved in conflicts became emotional defensive or accommodating when confronted by security. Marcus remained methodical, asking questions about policies and procedures with the confidence of someone who understood how these systems worked. "What specific concerns do you have about this passenger?" Officer Chen asked Victoria. Victoria had prepared for this question and delivered her response with a clinical precision that made discrimination sound like medical necessity. "I have generalized anxiety disorder with specific triggers related to unpredictable passenger behavior and unfamiliar social environments. My physician has documented these conditions and provided clear guidelines about situations that can cause severe psychological distress." "Has this passenger engaged in any threatening or disruptive behavior?" Officer Chen asked. Victoria hesitated. She couldn't point to any actual problematic behavior without revealing the discriminatory nature of her complaint. "It's not about observed behavior. It's about potential risks and my need for environmental controls that prevent medical emergencies." Marcus made another note in his manual documenting Victoria's admission that her request wasn't based on his actual behavior, but on her assumptions about potential future problems. Officer Chen noticed the way Marcus was recording the exchange, which suggested preparation and purpose that went beyond casual documentation. "Sir, could you explain why you're taking such detailed notes?" Officer Chen asked. "I'm documenting how airline crews and security personnel handle discrimination complaints disguised as medical accommodation requests," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. The statement landed like a revelation that changed everything. Elena realized that Marcus had just acknowledged he was deliberately evaluating crew performance, which suggested his presence on the flight wasn't coincidental. Officer Chen understood that she was dealing with someone who possessed knowledge about discrimination policies and legal procedures that went beyond typical passenger awareness. Michael Bennett stepped forward with growing desperation. The arrival of security was supposed to resolve the situation in Victoria's favor, but Marcus's questioning was exposing gaps in their approach that could trigger formal investigations and corporate liability. "Officer, this passenger has been uncooperative with crew instructions and disruptive to other passengers," Michael announced using language designed to justify enforcement action. "We need assistance ensuring compliance with passenger safety requirements." "What specific crew instructions has he violated?" Officer Chen asked. Michael realized he had walked into another trap. Marcus hadn't actually violated any official instructions, refused any legitimate requests, or engaged in disruptive behavior. The crew had pressured him to move based on another passenger's complaint, but they hadn't issued formal instructions that would justify enforcement action. "He's refused to accept alternative seating arrangements that would accommodate Mrs. Ashworth's medical needs," Michael replied weakly. Officer Chen understood the distinction. Refusing to cooperate voluntarily wasn't the same as violating mandatory instructions. If the airline wanted to relocate a passenger against their will, they needed specific regulatory justification that would survive legal challenge. Marcus turned to Officer Chen with renewed interest. "Could you clarify which regulation grants airlines authority to relocate passengers based on other passengers' comfort preferences?" Officer Chen felt the same chill of recognition that Captain Harrison and the crew members had experienced. Marcus was asking about specific regulations with the precision of someone who knew exactly what those regulations said and how they applied to this situation. "This is a medical accommodation issue," Victoria interjected, sensing that the narrative was shifting away from her favor. "I have documented conditions that require specific environmental controls." "What documentation?" Officer Chen asked. Victoria pulled out her phone and showed Officer Chen several screens of medical information. "My physician has provided detailed reports about anxiety triggers and environmental requirements for air travel safety." Officer Chen reviewed the documentation carefully. The medical reports were legitimate, but they described general anxiety disorder and environmental sensitivities without specific references to other passengers or discriminatory accommodation requests. Marcus looked up from his notes. Officer Chen, do those medical documents specifically authorize the exclusion of other passengers based on identity characteristics? The question was precise and devastating. Officer Chen realized that Marcus was asking whether Victoria's medical documentation actually supported discriminatory seating requests or whether it merely described general anxiety conditions that could be addressed through multiple accommodation methods. The medical documentation describes anxiety disorder and environmental sensitivities, Officer Chen replied carefully. It doesn't specifically address interactions with other passengers. Victoria felt the foundation of her complaint beginning to crack. Her medical documentation was real, but it didn't explicitly support her demand for Marcus's removal. She had been relying on implied authority and political pressure rather than specific medical justification. Sarah Collins was providing live commentary to her Instagram audience, which had grown to over 120,000 viewers, as news of the confrontation continued to spread across social media platforms. Major news outlets were now monitoring her live stream and preparing stories about airline discrimination and passenger rights. Security is here, but this passenger keeps asking questions that they can't answer, Sarah narrated to her followers. He knows these policies better than they do, and it's becoming obvious that this whole situation is discriminatory. Comments were flooding her stream with reaction support and theories about Marcus's identity. He sounds like a lawyer. Maybe he works for the airline. This is definitely going to court. She picked the wrong person to mess with. David Martinez was documenting the security interaction while simultaneously researching Pacific Airways' legal liability and corporate governance structure. As an investment banker, he understood that public relations disasters involving discrimination could trigger regulatory investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and executive changes. He was texting updates to his professional network security involvement escalating situation. Passenger demonstrating expert knowledge of aviation regulations. Potential major liability issues for Pacific Airways. Stock could be vulnerable if this goes viral. The responses were immediate. His colleagues were following the social media coverage and recognizing the business implications. Several were already monitoring Pacific Airways' stock price for potential trading opportunities related to the developing crisis. Captain James Harrison returned to the cabin as the security discussion continued. He was facing pressure from ground control about departure delays, corporate operations about VIP passenger complaints, and potentially federal regulations about discrimination and passenger rights. Officer Chen, what's the status of resolving this situation? James asked with barely controlled frustration. We're evaluating the specific justifications for the accommodation request, Officer Chen replied diplomatically. James realized that security wasn't automatically supporting the crew's position. Officer Chen was conducting an actual investigation rather than simply enforcing passenger compliance, which suggested that she recognized potential discrimination issues that required careful handling. Marcus stood up again and addressed Captain Harrison directly. Captain, I need you to understand that this situation is being documented for regulatory review. Every decision you make regarding discrimination policies will be evaluated against federal compliance requirements. James felt something shift in his understanding. Marcus wasn't just making threats or expressing general complaints. He was speaking with the authority of someone who understood regulatory review processes and had the knowledge to conduct such evaluations. Sir, are you suggesting that you have some official capacity to conduct regulatory reviews? James asked carefully. Marcus smiled slightly. I'm suggesting that this incident will be reviewed by people who have that capacity. The statement was carefully worded but loaded with implications. Elena realized that Marcus was acknowledging connections to regulatory authority without explicitly revealing his own position or identity. His approach suggested knowledge and access that went far beyond typical passenger awareness. Victoria was placing another phone call this time with obvious desperation. Her political influence and medical complaints weren't resolving the situation as quickly as expected, and Marcus's questioning was exposing weaknesses in her position that she hadn't anticipated. Senator Williams, it's Victoria Ashworth. I need immediate intervention regarding a discrimination situation on Pacific Airways Flight 482. Her voice carried an edge of panic that hadn't been present in her earlier calls. This passenger appears to have some kind of official connections and is interfering with security operations. The conversation was speakerphone loud, designed to demonstrate her political influence while also revealing her growing concern about Marcus's apparent authority. Yes, I understand the complexity, but this situation is escalating beyond normal passenger service issues. Marcus continued taking notes during Victoria's phone call, documenting her admission that she recognized his connections to official authority. Officer Chen noticed the way he was recording not just the conversation, but the implied threats and political pressure being deployed to influence security decisions. Other passengers were now openly filming and posting updates about the security involvement. The federal judge in Seat 4A was taking detailed notes about constitutional issues and potential civil rights violations. The technology executive was live streaming to LinkedIn, describing the situation as a case study in discrimination and corporate liability. Elena's phone buzzed with another message from her supervisor, corporate legal, requesting immediate documentation of all passenger statements and crew actions. Potential federal investigation requiring comprehensive incident reports. The message confirmed Elena's worst fears. This situation wasn't just affecting individual careers anymore. It was attracting attention from corporate legal departments and potentially federal investigators who specialized in discrimination and civil rights violations. Officer Chen concluded her review of Victoria's medical documentation and turned to address both passengers directly. Based on my evaluation, Mrs. Ashworth has legitimate medical documentation for anxiety disorder, but it doesn't specifically authorize exclusion of other passengers from their confirmed seating assignments. She looked at Marcus with growing respect and concern. Sir, your knowledge of airline policies and regulatory procedures suggests professional familiarity with these issues. Could you clarify your background or expertise? Marcus closed his manual and looked at Officer Chen with the first hint of the authority he had been concealing throughout the confrontation. My background will become relevant shortly. What's important now is ensuring that this situation is handled according to established anti-discrimination protocols. Officer Chen felt a chill of recognition. Marcus was speaking with the quiet authority of someone who possessed knowledge and position that would soon become apparent. His documentation expert questioning and professional approach suggested that this confrontation was being evaluated by someone with the power to implement serious consequences. Victoria ended her phone call and turned to face Marcus directly for the first time since making her initial demand. Her elegant composure was beginning to crack as she realized that her political influence and medical complaints weren't resolving the situation as expected. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm someone who evaluates exactly these kinds of situations for a living." The cabin fell silent as passengers processed the implications of Marcus's statement. Elena realized that they were about to discover who Marcus Thompson really was, and why his presence on Flight 482 was about to change everything they thought they understood about power authority and consequences. The moment that would change everything began with a quiet conversation between Officer Chen and her radio dispatch. She had stepped away from the passenger seating area to verify some details about regulatory procedures, and her voice carried just far enough for Elena to overhear fragments of the exchange. "I need verification on discrimination protocols for commercial aviation." "Yes, I understand, but this passenger is asking questions that suggest official knowledge. Could you check if we have any federal inspectors or regulatory officials on board?" Elena felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications of Officer Chen's inquiry. Marcus's questioning, professional documentation, and expert knowledge of aviation regulations had triggered security concerns about his potential official capacity. Captain James Harrison was growing increasingly anxious about the extended delay and its operational implications. Ground control was pressuring him for departure updates, corporate operations was demanding resolution of the VIP complaint, and now security was conducting investigations that could involve federal regulatory agencies. He made a decision that would prove to be pivotal. James pulled out his phone and called Rebecca Morrison, Senior Vice President of Customer Relations, directly. "Rebecca, this is Captain Harrison on Flight 482. I need immediate clarification about a passenger situation that's becoming complicated. We have someone aboard who appears to have professional knowledge of aviation regulations, and I'm concerned about potential oversight or inspection issues." The conversation was quiet, but Elena was positioned close enough to hear James's side of the exchange. "No, he's not creating problems, but he's asking very specific questions about discrimination policies. Yes, I understand the VIP situation, but this passenger seems to know our procedures better than our crew does." There was a long pause as James listened to Rebecca's response, and Elena watched his face gradually change from confusion to concern to something approaching panic. "Are you absolutely sure?" James asked quietly. "Marcus Thompson, Chief Training Officer, National Aviation Consortium." "Oh no, oh no, no, no." The words carried across the cabin like a whispered earthquake. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she processed what she had just heard. Marcus Thompson, Chief Training Officer, National Aviation Consortium. She grabbed Michael's arm urgently. "Did you hear that? Did you hear what the captain just said? Michael was still focused on managing Victoria's complaints and coordinating with security." "What are you talking about, Marcus Thompson?" Elena whispered with growing horror. "The captain just said he's the Chief Training Officer for the National Aviation Consortium." Michael's face went blank as the implications penetrated his awareness. The National Aviation Consortium was the organization responsible for certifying flight crews across major U.S. airlines. The Chief Training Officer was the person who designed training protocols, evaluated crew performance, and had authority to revoke certifications. They had been pressuring, arguing with, and attempting to forcibly relocate the man who controlled their professional credentials and career futures. Captain Harrison ended his phone call and walked slowly back toward the passenger seating area, his face showing the shock of someone who had just discovered that he had been commanding a superior officer to follow orders that violated every policy that officer had written. Officer Chen returned from her radio consultation with a puzzled expression that was rapidly transforming into professional concern. She had requested verification about potential regulatory officials aboard the flight, and the response she received had changed her entire understanding of the situation. Captain Harrison, Officer Chen, said quietly, "I just received some very interesting information from my supervisor." James nodded grimly. "I think I just received the same information." Marcus looked up from his notes and smiled slightly, recognizing that his identity was about to be revealed through official channels rather than his own disclosure. He had been content to let the situation develop naturally, documenting crew behavior and passenger reactions without revealing his authority. But the convergence of security investigations and corporate inquiries was about to make concealment impossible. Victoria was still on her phone with political contacts, unaware that the balance of power was shifting dramatically beneath her feet. Senator Williams understands the seriousness of this discrimination situation. He's prepared to intervene directly with Pacific Airways executive leadership to ensure appropriate resolution. She ended the call and turned to address Officer Chen with renewed confidence. Federal officials are now monitoring this situation. Everyone needs to understand that passenger safety and anti-discrimination protections are being enforced at the highest levels. Marcus closed his manual and looked at Victoria with something that might have been irony. "Mrs. Ashworth, you're absolutely right. Anti-discrimination protections are being enforced at the highest levels." Officer Chen took a deep breath and addressed the situation directly. "Mr. Thompson, my supervisor, has confirmed your position with the National Aviation Consortium. I need to apologize for any inconvenience this situation has caused." The words fell into the cabin like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples of shock and recognition that spread throughout the first-class section. Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Marcus Thompson, the chief training officer who had certified her to work as a flight attendant, the man who designed the discrimination policies she had been trained to follow, the person whose approval was required for her continued employment in commercial aviation. She had been pressuring him to give up his seat to accommodate a discriminatory request. Michael's confident authority evaporated as he processed the full scope of what had just happened. The VIP passenger service that had defined his career success, the political pressure that had seemed so compelling, the medical justifications that had appeared so legitimate, all of it had led him to violate every anti-discrimination protocol he had been trained to follow, and he had done it in front of the person who had written those protocols. Captain Harrison stepped forward with the bearing of someone preparing to face court-martial proceedings. "Mr. Thompson, I need to apologize for the crew's handling of this situation. We clearly failed to follow proper discrimination protocols." Marcus stood up fully for the first time since the confrontation began, and everyone in the cabin could see the quiet authority that his casual clothes had effectively concealed. He wasn't tall or imposing, but his presence commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with physical stature. "Captain Harrison, thank you for that acknowledgement," Marcus said professionally. "What's important now is understanding how and why established policies were bypassed in favor of accommodating discriminatory requests." Sarah Collins was live-streaming the revelation to her Instagram audience, which had grown to over 150,000 viewers as news of the identity disclosure spread across social media platforms. "Oh my God," Sarah exclaimed to her phone. "This passenger is the chief training officer for Airline crews. He's the guy who trains all these people, and they just spent an hour trying to discriminate against him." Comments exploded across her stream. "This is insane. She picked the wrong person. He's been documenting their discrimination this whole time. Justice is coming. This is going to change everything." David Martinez put down his phone and stared at Marcus with newfound respect and growing concern about the business implications. The chief training officer of the National Aviation Consortium had just documented extensive policy violations, discrimination, and corporate pressure to bypass anti-bias protections. Pacific Airways wasn't just facing a passenger complaint anymore. They were facing potential regulatory investigation, federal oversight, and corporate liability that could affect their operating licenses. Victoria was the last to understand what had happened. She was still focused on her political phone calls and medical justifications, unaware that her carefully constructed complaint had just been revealed as discrimination against one of the most influential people in the commercial aviation. "I don't understand what's happening," Victoria said, looking around the cabin with growing confusion. "This passenger has been disruptive and uncooperative. Security should be enforcing compliance with medical accommodation requests." Marcus turned to face Victoria directly for the first time since her initial demand. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had been evaluating her behavior against professional standards throughout their entire interaction. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm Marcus Thompson, Chief Training Officer for the National Aviation Consortium. I'm responsible for designing and implementing the anti-discrimination policies that govern commercial aviation across 15 major U.S. airlines, including Pacific Airways." Victoria's face went blank as she processed the implications. The casual passenger she had been trying to have removed was the person who controlled training standards, certification requirements, and policy implementation for the entire aviation industry. "Your foundation's aviation safety work is funded through grants that I review and approve," Marcus continued professionally. "Your board positions on aviation safety organizations report to committees that I advise. Your political advocacy for passenger protection is implemented through policies that I write." Victoria realized that every source of influence and authority she had deployed against Marcus was ultimately derived from systems that he controlled. Her foundation work board memberships and political connections in aviation were all connected to the regulatory framework that Marcus oversaw. The discrimination complaint you filed against me will be evaluated against standards that I developed," Marcus added. "The crew training failures you've witnessed today will be addressed through protocols that I designed. The corporate policies that failed to protect passenger rights will be revised according to recommendations that I provide." Elena felt tears beginning to form as she understood the full scope of what had transpired. She had been trained by the best anti-discrimination policies in commercial aviation, but when faced with political pressure and VIP complaints, she had abandoned everything she had been taught. "Mr. Thompson," Elena said quietly, "I need to apologize. I knew this situation was wrong, but I was scared about my job and didn't have the courage to follow my training." Marcus looked at her with something that might have been understanding. Elena fear doesn't excuse policy violations, but recognizing mistakes is the first step toward learning from them. Michael stepped forward with the demeanor of someone preparing for professional execution. "Sir, I take full responsibility for the crew's handling of this situation. I prioritized VIP accommodation over anti-discrimination protocols." "Why?" Marcus asked simply. Michael struggled to formulate an answer that didn't reveal the ugly calculations behind his decisions. "Mrs. Ashworth has significant political influence and corporate connections. I was concerned about potential consequences for refusing her requests." "So you decided that political influence outweighed passenger rights?" Marcus asked. Michael realized there was no answer that would excuse his choice to prioritize VIP pressure over established policies. "Yes, sir, I made the wrong decision." Officer Chen was documenting the entire exchange, understanding that she was witnessing a case study in discrimination, corporate pressure, and accountability that would have lasting implications for aviation industry training and policy development. Victoria made one final attempt to salvage her position. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you understand that my concerns were legitimate. I have documented medical conditions that require specific accommodations." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Ashworth, your medical conditions are indeed documented. But could you explain how those conditions specifically require the exclusion of other passengers based on their identity characteristics?" Victoria realized that Marcus was asking her to explicitly acknowledge the discriminatory nature of her requests. Her medical documentation described anxiety and environmental sensitivities, but it didn't authorize racial exclusion disguised as accommodation. My physician recommended environmental controls that promote calm and safety," Victoria replied weakly. "Which specific environmental factors associated with my presence triggered your medical condition?" Marcus asked again. Victoria couldn't answer without explicitly acknowledging that her complaint was based on racial bias rather than legitimate medical accommodation. Her carefully constructed justification was being dismantled by the same questioning that had exposed crew policy failures throughout the confrontation. Marcus made one final note in his manual and closed it definitively. "This incident will be documented comprehensively and used to improve training protocols for aviation industry personnel across the country." He looked around the cabin at the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. "Everyone aboard this aircraft has seen how discrimination can be disguised as accommodation, how political pressure can override policy compliance, and how individual courage can challenge institutional bias." Sarah Collins had tears in her eyes as she addressed her Instagram audience one final time. "This is why we fight. This is why we document. This is why we never stop speaking up. Because sometimes, just sometimes, justice is watching." The cabin fell silent as passengers processed what they had witnessed. Victoria Ashworth's political influence hadn't protected her from accountability. The crew's prioritization of VIP complaints hadn't prevented professional consequences. And Marcus Thompson's quiet dignity had transformed a moment of discrimination into a lesson in institutional change. Elena Rodriguez looked at Marcus with newfound understanding. "What happens now?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Now we learn from what happened here and make sure it never happens again." The immediate aftermath of Marcus's identity revelation moved with the swift efficiency of institutional machinery suddenly focused on damage control and policy compliance. Within minutes of Officer Chen's confirmation, the corporate response began cascading through multiple levels of Pacific Airways management. Michael Bennett was the first to face direct consequences. His supervisor, Sarah Kim, boarded the aircraft within 20 minutes and approached him with the grim expression of someone delivering career-ending news. "Michael, you're suspended pending investigation," Sarah announced quietly. "Corporate legal requires immediate review of all crew actions related to discrimination protocols." Michael's 10-year career with Pacific Airways was effectively over. His prioritization of VIP complaints over anti-discrimination policies had been documented by the person responsible for writing those policies. There would be no appeal, no alternative explanation, no corporate protection for decisions that violated federal compliance requirements. He gathered his crew materials silently, understanding that his choice to accommodate Victoria's discriminatory requests had cost him everything he had worked to achieve. As he walked toward the aircraft exit, Elena watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief that her own mistakes hadn't been quite as comprehensive. Elena faced a different kind of accountability. Marcus requested a private conversation with her before departing the aircraft, and she approached him with the nervous energy of someone whose career hung in the balance. Elena Marcus said professionally, "You recognized that the situation was wrong, but you failed to follow established protocols when pressured by supervisors and VIP passengers." Elena nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I was scared of losing my job, but that doesn't excuse abandoning my training." "It doesn't," Marcus agreed, "but acknowledging mistakes honestly is the first step toward learning from them. You'll be required to complete additional anti-discrimination training, but your employment status isn't terminated." Elena felt a mixture of relief and determination. She had been given a second chance, and she was committed to ensuring that fear would never override her principles again. Captain James Harrison faced the most complex consequences because his position carried ultimate responsibility for aircraft operations and passenger safety. Marcus's evaluation would determine whether James retained command authority or faced certification review. "Captain, your crew's discrimination failures occurred under your command," Marcus stated directly. "How do you plan to prevent similar situations in the future?" James had spent the past hour mentally reviewing his decisions and their implications. "Sir, I prioritized operational efficiency and VIP accommodation over passenger rights and policy compliance. I failed in my duty to ensure equal treatment for all passengers." "What will you do differently?" Marcus asked. "I'll implement mandatory crew briefings about anti-discrimination protocols before every flight," James replied. "I'll establish clear authority structures that prevent political pressure from overriding policy compliance. And I'll ensure that passenger rights are protected regardless of other passengers' political influence." Marcus evaluated James's response and made a note in his documentation. "You'll be required to undergo additional training and policy review, but your certification isn't revoked. Leadership means learning from mistakes, not avoiding them." Victoria Ashworth faced the most devastating consequences because her actions had triggered comprehensive review of her Foundation work board memberships and political advocacy in aviation safety. Marcus's position gave him influence over the exact systems that had granted Victoria her industry authority. "Mrs. Ashworth," Marcus said professionally, "your Foundation's aviation safety funding will be reviewed for compliance with anti-discrimination requirements." Victoria felt her world collapsing as she realized that her political influence in aviation was derived from regulatory frameworks that Marcus controlled. Her board positions, charitable grants, and policy advocacy were all subject to oversight by the person she had tried to discriminate against. "Your board membership with the National Aviation Foundation will be evaluated against diversity and inclusion standards," Marcus continued. "Your Foundation's grant applications will be reviewed for alignment with passenger protection principles." Victoria's carefully constructed influence in aviation safety was being dismantled by someone who possessed the authority to implement such review. Her political connections couldn't protect her from regulatory oversight, and her wealth couldn't insulate her from professional accountability. Officer Chen completed her incident report with the efficiency of someone who understood the federal compliance implications of documented discrimination. Her report would trigger investigations by multiple regulatory agencies and ensure that the incident became part of official policy review processes. Mr. Thompson, this incident will be forwarded to the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights for review. Officer Chen confirmed. The documentation will also be shared with the Federal Aviation Administration's Compliance Monitoring Division. Marcus nodded his approval. Thank you, Officer Chen. This incident will become part of industry-wide training materials to prevent similar discrimination in the future. The passengers who had witnessed and documented the confrontation became part of the accountability process as well. Sarah Collins's live stream had reached over 200,000 viewers and been reshared by major news outlets across the country. Her documentation provided public transparency that would prevent corporate attempts to minimize or conceal the incident. David Martinez shared his documentation with his professional network, ensuring that the business and legal implications of discrimination were understood by corporate leaders throughout the aviation industry. His analysis would influence investment decisions and risk assessments that affected airline operations across the country. The federal judge who had taken detailed notes about constitutional issues was already planning to reference the incident in future civil rights cases. The technology executive's LinkedIn documentation had sparked discussions about corporate accountability and discrimination policies among business leaders nationwide. Within hours of Marcus's identity revelation, Pacific Airways issued a corporate statement acknowledging policy failures and announcing comprehensive review of anti-discrimination training across their entire operation. The statement referenced Marcus's evaluation and committed to implementing his recommendations for improved passenger protection. Victoria's Foundation issued a statement expressing regret for the incident and announcing review of their advocacy positions to ensure alignment with passenger protection principles. Her board positions were quietly terminated within days as organizations distanced themselves from her documented discrimination. The incident triggered broader industry changes as well. The National Aviation Consortium announced new training requirements for crew certification that emphasized anti-discrimination protocols and resistance to political pressure. Marcus's documentation became part of mandatory training materials for aviation personnel across 15 major airlines. But the most significant consequence was the transformation of institutional understanding about discrimination, accountability, and leadership. Marcus's quiet dignity under pressure had demonstrated that true authority came from principled behavior rather than political influence or wealth. Elena Rodriguez returned to work with renewed commitment to passenger rights and policy compliance. Michael Bennett's termination sent a clear message throughout Pacific Airways about the consequences of prioritizing VIP complaints over anti-discrimination protections. Captain James Harrison implemented the crew briefing protocols he had promised, ensuring that passenger rights were protected on every flight under his command. His experience with Marcus became a teaching tool for other pilots about the importance of policy compliance over political pressure. Victoria Ashworth's influence in aviation safety was permanently diminished, but the systems that had enabled her discrimination were strengthened to prevent similar abuse. Her foundation's reduced role in policy advocacy created opportunities for organizations with stronger commitments to equality and inclusion. The swift implementation of consequences demonstrated that accountability was possible when discrimination was properly documented and evaluated by people with authority to enforce change. Marcus's approach had created a template for institutional response that could be replicated across other industries and organizations. The incident became a case study in business schools, law schools, and public policy programs as an example of how individual dignity and institutional accountability could work together to create lasting change. Students studied Marcus's questioning techniques, Victoria's abuse of medical accommodation, and the crew's failure to maintain policy compliance under pressure. Most importantly, the consequences extended beyond individual punishment to create better protection for future passengers. The policies that Marcus strengthened based on this incident would prevent thousands of similar discrimination attempts across the aviation industry. Elena Rodriguez approached Marcus before he deplaned her hands, trembling with nervous energy and profound regret. The weight of what had transpired hung between them like a bridge that needed to be crossed before either could move forward. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to know that I recognized what was happening was wrong from the beginning. But I was terrified of losing my job, of disappointing my family, of failing after they had sacrificed so much for my education." Marcus studied her face carefully, seeing not defiance or excuses, but genuine remorse and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about courage and compromise. "Elena, tell me what you learned today." "I learned that fear isn't an acceptable excuse for abandoning my principles," Elena replied, tears forming in her eyes. "I learned that doing the right thing requires courage, even when it threatens everything you've worked for. And I learned that the policies you taught us aren't just rules to follow. When it's convenient, they're protection for people who need someone to stand up for them." Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to her. "When you're ready to be the flight attendant you train to be rather than the one who gets scared under pressure, call me. This industry needs people who learn from their mistakes rather than repeating them." Elena looked at the card and saw that he had written, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear." She tucked it carefully into her pocket, understanding that she had been given something more valuable than second chances. She had been given wisdom earned through confronting her own failures. Captain James Harrison waited until all passengers had deplaned before approaching Marcus with the bearing of someone who had spent hours examining his own leadership and finding it wanting. "Sir, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you acknowledgement that I failed every principle you trained me to uphold." Marcus nodded, but didn't make the conversation easier with false reassurance. James' leadership means protecting people who can't protect themselves. Today, you chose operational convenience and political pressure over passenger rights. What are you going to do to ensure that never happens again? "I'm implementing mandatory anti-discrimination briefings before every flight," James replied. "But more than that, I'm committing to being the kind of captain who creates an environment where crew members like Elena feel safe to do the right thing even when it's difficult." Marcus smiled for the first time that day, recognizing genuine leadership growth in James's response. That's exactly what this industry needs. Not perfect people, but people who learn from imperfection and build better systems. 6 months later, Elena Rodriguez was promoted to senior flight attendant and began training new crew members about dignity, equality, and courage under pressure. She used her experience with Marcus as a teaching tool, helping others understand that principles matter most when they're tested by fear. The training program she developed became part of standard crew certification across Pacific Airways, and her story about learning from failure became one of the most powerful examples in Marcus's industry-wide discrimination prevention materials. Captain Harrison's commitment to pre-flight briefings created a model that was adopted across multiple airlines, and his leadership in implementing anti-discrimination protocols earned recognition from the aviation industry's diversity and inclusion organizations. His experience had transformed him from someone who managed problems to someone who prevented them. But the most profound transformation belonged to Victoria Ashworth. Stripped of her influence in aviation policy and facing social media scrutiny that followed her for months, she was forced to confront the reality of how her privilege had been weaponized against others. A year after the incident, she quietly reached out to Marcus through an intermediary, not to request forgiveness or rehabilitation, but to ask how she could contribute to anti-discrimination efforts in a way that supported, rather than undermined, equality. Her foundation redirected its efforts toward funding educational programs that taught wealthy passengers about unconscious bias and discriminatory behavior. Marcus responded to her outreach with cautious optimism, understanding that real change required acknowledging harm rather than simply avoiding future mistakes. Victoria's transformation from perpetrator to ally became another powerful teaching tool about redemption through accountability. The incident created ripple effects that extended far beyond individual careers and corporate policies. Marcus's documentation and quiet dignity under pressure became a template for responding to discrimination that was studied in law school's business programs and civil rights organizations. His approach, asking questions rather than making demands, documenting rather than arguing, maintaining principles without escalating conflict, demonstrated how individual courage could leverage institutional accountability to create lasting change. The story spread beyond aviation into other industries, where employees faced similar pressures to accommodate discriminatory requests from powerful customers. Marcus's example inspired workers in hospitality, retail, and service industries to prioritize policy compliance over customer appeasement when discrimination was involved. Most importantly, the incident reminded everyone involved that real authority comes not from wealth, political connections, or social status, but from character competence and commitment to principles that protect rather than privilege. Marcus Thompson's quiet power had transformed a moment of discrimination into a movement for institutional accountability that continued to influence aviation safety and passenger rights for years to come. And when Elena Rodriguez finally used that business card to call Marcus about opportunities for advancement, he told her something that captured the true meaning of what had happened on Flight 482. You didn't just learn to be a better flight attendant, Elena. You learned to be a better human being. That's the only training that really matters. If you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of how they look or where they sit, this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the quietest voices who refuse to let injustice speak louder than truth. Thank you for watching, and remember, real authority doesn't come from the power to punish others. It comes from the courage to protect them.